Ready whenever you are, Anthony.
Okay, thanks, Becky. And hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us on a very sunny afternoon, certainly in Manchester anyway. Welcome to the third event in the Speaking for English series based around impact and public engagement. When the English Association first discussed these ideas, the idea for this series a few months ago, I was working on a book at the time linked to it. I'm Anthony Rowland. I'm a member of the Higher Education Committee for the English Association. And I was working on a book, and you can see in the background, chapter 1 of my book is on the holograms. And as I was working on these holograms at a Holocaust museum in New York, I thought, I wonder if there are any impact case studies I don't know about from REF 2021 in English studies on literature and technology. And I started out from literature, and as I kind of looked at what was there, it became clear that there's a whole breadth of case studies in English studies more widely. But when I first went on the REF 2021 website, there are about 5 kind of keywords that you can use to look at the database, one of which is technology. But interestingly, when I kind of typed in that in technology, nothing came up. According to that, there were no case studies in the whole of English studies in technology, which I knew just couldn't be right. So because when I went back and put in the keyword technology, immediately 15 to 20 case studies immediately came up, and there were some really great impact case studies that we just didn't have space to include in this session. Great ones, for example, at Oxford Brookes University and the University of Edinburgh as well. But what I decided I wanted to do in this session was to try and give a sense of the breadth of case studies about technology across English studies. So in this session, we have presentations on technology in the heritage sector, museum studies. We have a presentation on literature, narratives more widely, and artificial intelligence. We have a presentation from corpus linguistics and developing particular kinds of software. And also we have presentation from creative writing, developing technology to do with disability as well. So we will, as in the previous events in this series, start off with presentations from the 4 speakers. We'll be speaking for about 7 minutes or so. Then we'll save Q&A till the end. As we're going along, if you want to type questions in the chat, that would be great. I'll pick those up as the chair later on. Or you can just, when we get to the end of the papers, just raise your hand, and you can unmute your mic and give me questions that way. And of course, just to reiterate that this event is being recorded for the English Association. Okay, firstly, we have Gabriella Giannacchi, who's joining us, I think, from Italy. Gabriella today. Gabriella is a professor in performance and new media at the University of Exeter. And she's also a visiting professor at the University of Turin in Italy. She's published several books, including Virtual Theatres, The Politics of New Media Theatre, Performing Nature, Explorations in Ecology in the Arts, also Archive Everything, great title, and some edited collections as well, Histories of Performance Documentation and Documentation of Art. Probably most recent book is Technologies as a Self-Portrait from 2022. Gabriella has collaborated with several museums in the UK, the US, and the Netherlands, some of which she'll be talking about in this presentation. Okay, thanks, Gabriella.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for inviting me today, and apologies in advance because I have terrible Wi-Fi and I'm currently connecting with my phone. So hopefully I managed to talk for 7 minutes without crashing, but apologies if I do crash. So I'm talking about my impact case study, which, as you can see, has an extremely long title, transforming the way art and heritage institutions document, preserve, and exhibit audiences' engagement with their collections. I can't tell you how many times we changed this title over the course of the years in which we drafted numerous versions of this case study, but in the end, we all decided that the title actually has to say what I do, and I'm afraid that actually that is indeed what I do and what I claim to have done in my case study. So what I want to focus on today are really two key things for a case study. And the first is the underpinning research, and the second, obviously, are the impacts. What I work on and what I have been working on for many years is a documentation of complex hybrid heritage, focusing particularly on intangible heritage, so anything really performative and digital. And for museums, this is quite a new field in the sense that obviously they have documented heritage for a long time, but they've only started to collect performative and digital heritage in very recent years. So actually what they should, in this case, document and preserve for future generations has been a question mark of much research carried out in this field. The first project that I worked on in this field was Performing Presence, funded by the HRC, which was led by Nick Kay, also here at Exeter. In this project, for the first time, we used virtual reality to document and preserve an artwork by the American performance artist Lynn Hirschman Leeson. And that kind of enabled us, through collaboration with UCL Computer Science Department and also archaeology at Stanford, to kind of start to explore different methodologies for the documentation of these complex hybrid heritage works. I then started a much longer collaboration with the Mixed Reality Lab at the University of Nottingham, which was funded by RCUK under the Horizon Digital Economy Programme. And as you can see, that was 11 years of research, an incredible luxury to be able to work in funded research in that way. And what became really important to me here was that knowledge would be, or ought to be, advanced both in my field, but also for my scientist colleagues. So we published, or started to publish extensively, in both computer science led by them, and indeed in kind of various types of sites, whether it was visual art, stroke, performance studies, stroke, cultural heritage, stroke, different kinds of fields in the humanities. So what if, for example, the Performing Mixed Reality book entails is actually a framework for the creation and design of performance in mixed reality, which also includes documentation, but it doesn't exclusively include documentation. And we were able to present this framework at various computer science conferences. At the same time, I started to notice that a lot of these mixed reality works are experienced extremely subjectively, and therefore that the documentation of the user experience was absolutely paramount to understanding what was actually going on in these works, what these works consisted of. Bear in mind, again, we're not talking about artworks where there is an object, which we can all look at. We're talking about roughly experiences, quite often participatory experiences. So what the third publication here tells you really is the way that I work. So the Sinker and Stack are two Tate staff members. Rebecca Sinker was in charge of public engagement, and John Stack was in charge of the digital strategy. He's actually now at the Science Museum, but at the time he was at the Tate. And it was very important for me that Tate staff who collaborated with me in this project and in the subsequent project that you see there would be able to publish as well as myself. Locatelli was my then PhD student, collaborative PhD student with the Tate. Collaborative PhD students are key strategy to working collaboratively with an organization. And it was very important to me that she would be a member of the team, and that also meant publishing with us. And finally, the last names that you see there are the computer scientists who are also included in all the humanities publications. So that for me is a really good strategy to kind of produce impacts, which is really inter and transdisciplinary. The subsequent project, called Performance at Tate, was then a kind of refinement of my collaboration with the Tate, which started with the previous project. Here we looked at how Tate really collected, documented, and exhibited performance over an extended period of time. They had done that, but they had no public history of this. They had nothing that anybody could look at. So we created a very large site, which is now on the Tate website, but we also started to look into how other key museums in the world actually documented and started to collect performance since the 1960s. So this is a edited volume that I did with the PDRA on the project Jonah Westerman. Finally, I had become really interested in how other organizations which were not museums or which were not kind of established in this field would be dealing with the same kind of issue of documenting, exhibiting, preserving performative kind of works. And somebody said to me that Exeter City Football Club actually had an incredible sporting heritage collection. This was in the days when sporting heritage was not talked about as much as it is now. So it seemed like a strange but crazy thing. And I love strange and crazy things. So I said, yes, let's absolutely look into that. And we found that they had a huge history and associated sporting heritage. And we're lucky enough to be funded by what was then called the Heritage Lottery Fund in 3 projects, as you can see, between 2016 and 2020. The first was literally to understand what this heritage was, why was it performative, why did it need to be digitized, who did it belong to, and so we cataloged it, we organized it in various ways, including a massive digital archive. Then we realized that we had so much heritage, we could actually create a museum out of that, a proper physical museum as part of the club. So we sought HLF funding again, and we did create a huge museum, which is now part of Devon Museums. And finally, the HLF asked us to kind of tell a story in a way that other sporting heritage clubs, especially football clubs in this case, could create similar initiatives. And so we then celebrated what we've done and created a massive outreach program. And there are now indeed quite a lot of museums which followed our tracks. So you could see how all this started with how do we document performative and digital works, and ended up with how do we document anything and how do we preserve and exhibit anything that really has to do with events, with things which do not have a tangible dimension. They may leave remains which are tangible, but in itself are not. So what are the impacts of such a thing? So what I claimed is that this work was able to change a way in which a number of museums, primarily in the UK and in Europe, and one museum in the US, now document, preserve, and exhibit this kind of work. And this was primarily done by including audiences into this process. You could see from the top 2 images that the kind of work we do has 2 features. One was a lot of this work is performative, as I said. Audiences are not static, they're dynamic, they participate, they're part of the work. The work is not really separable from them. Second, audiences document. I mean, you only need to go to a museum to find out that audiences literally experience now works by taking photographs of them. So these 2 key things are now part of quite a lot of museums, ways in which they make sense of these kind of works. Second, I claimed that my research had promoted novel forms of community engagement with art and heritage through new kinds of digital platforms. This was really the result of the collaboration with the Mixed Reality Lab, but then also an independent platform designer in Devon. We were able, right from the beginning of all of these projects, to work with stakeholders. And this is absolutely key in obtaining impacts. I review quite a lot of projects where PIs claim that they will have massive impacts, but actually, if you read the proposal, they never consult the stakeholders. So I think, how can they have impacts if they don't work with the stakeholders? So this, for me, has been a key part of what I've learned over the years in developing impact pathways where you work together with the people that you're developing the work for. Finally, I claim that I was able to establish a pioneering volunteer-run sporting heritage museum, and I've told you that story before. But what I didn't tell you was that we, on top of various digital platforms, we also created numerous exhibitions and museum films about different communities that kind of make up the history of this particular club. But the key thing here, again, that everything we did was co-curated. So there was a significant knowledge transfer in the process of doing that with communities that really do not ordinarily attend museums, that do not identify with heritage, and they do not normally want to be involved in these kind of activities. And that included several people with mild dementia who normally find it difficult to remember anything, but who put in front of photographs taken some 60, 70 years ago, actually remembered everything and were absolutely proud of themselves for being able to contribute to an archive and the telling of the kind of history of heritage of that archive. So this, in a nutshell, was my impact case study. I hope to have given you a flavor of the kind of range of work that I've done, which all falls under the same headline, this kind of rather long title, which has to do with documentation, preservation, exhibition of audiences, as well as of the heritage, because the heritage ultimately has to do with the reception by different kinds of audiences. And hopefully my Wi-Fi has worked all the way through. Thank you again for giving me this opportunity to share my story.
Thanks, Gabriella. That was great. Thanks for sticking to time. Yeah, the Wi-Fi was operating fine. I love the way when reading your impact case study that you started off with the digital as a way to record, to map, to archive the performances. But then as you move through the narrative of the case study, you get to the point where when you're talking about Exeter City Football Club and the digital archive and the museum that you've just done, that it's the digital archive is developed alongside the kind of physical presence of the real museum as well. So I thought that was a great story. Thanks very much. As I said, we'll take questions at the end, so we shall move straight on to Sarah. Sarah Dillon, who is Professor of Literature and the Public Humanities at Cambridge, University of Cambridge. She specialises in contemporary literature and film, and in particular the intersections of narratives and science and speculative fiction. She's the author of several books as well, including one in preparation at the moment, How to Study the Contemporary, which is published Story Listening, Narrative Evidence and Public Reasoning, Deconstruction, Feminism, Film, and The Palimpsest, Literature, Criticism and Theory. She's also the author of several articles and book chapters on contemporary literature and film, including David Mitchell, Critical Essays, and co-editor of Maggie G, Critical Essays. She's also published a book on AI narratives, which I know, of course, will be very important to the talk that we're about to have. And she's also a broadcaster for BBC Radio 3 and Radio 4, I think, so. Yeah, don't you put your mic on, Sarah? And then we're there, we can see the presentation.
My apologies, it was not allowing me to unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's fine, that's good.
My apologies. Hello, lovely. Thank you for having me here, and really interesting to hear the other case studies. So I've been asked to talk about the AI narratives case study. I thought the easiest thing to do was just cut the front bit of the impact case study onto the first slide, so you have an overview. This was a collaborative case study, as Gabriella's was, with me, my postdoc, Dr. Kanta-Dihal, and some other researchers at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence, where at least the early stages of the work took place. I, without consultation, have chosen the same kind of approach. So I will talk a little bit about the research and then about the types of impact that it had. This slide shows you a selection of the publications that came out of the underlying research. We had a project on AI narratives at CFI, that's the shorthand for the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence. We held many interdisciplinary cross-sector workshops across the course of a year or so, and obviously did our own reading and writing and thinking. The sort of flagship publication is the book you can see on this slide, AI Narratives, A History of Imaginative Thinking About Intelligent Machines. This provides a history from antiquity to the present of imaginings, as it says, of intelligent machines. It's going back prior to the actual instantiation of the technology in the 20th century, but looking at way back even as far as Greek narratives, imagining what it would mean for a machine to be sentient or have autonomy or simply play a role in decision making or government. And so it obviously was a collaborative academic publication as well, with chapters in there from specialists in each of the periods and types of literature that we cover in the book. So a real kind of group effort in that sense. There were also individual publications in various outlets, and another collaboration which followed on from the AI narratives work, which was funded by Boeing, and which led to this publication in Futures on Futures of Autonomous Flight, which is connected to the narratives work, not because we were looking at narratives of autonomous flight, although we did in a bit of the project, but because we were using a narrative futures method to determine contemporary anticipatory assumptions about the future. So narrative was playing a slightly different role in that project, but circling around the same ideas about AI and technologies and public perception of them. So the consequence of all this research was a strong case that we made for the way in which narratives of AI have an influence on researchers themselves, on the development of the technology, on public policy making, on public discourse. And this claim was then evidenced through not just the rigor of the academic work, but the way in which we then engaged with various stakeholders outside of academia. And this is where I don't see a kind of linear, you do your research and then you produce your impact, but that the engagement outside of our own disciplines and outside of the academy was part of the intellectual work of the project as well. So my postdoc Cantor was in a collaboration with this it's sort of multimedia exhibition that was held in Cambridge, Crowded Room with the company behind it. It was an installation at the Junction Theatre here in Cambridge, and it was made in collaboration with technologists and informed by conversations, and you can see some of them there with young people in Cambridge, Kenya and Nepal. And it was to get people who don't normally engage, a bit like Gabriella said, with the arts or with cultural exhibitions, to come and to be prompted to think about the sort of consequences and impacts of AI through a kind of narrative medium. We also developed quite a long-term friendship with Cognition X, which is a big annual festival of kind of AI, which attracts people from right across from industry to government to academia and all branches of academia. And we presented at CogX for 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. So there was a kind of long-term relationship built there, disseminating and engaging with various aspects of the stage of the project that it was at that year. And you can see one of the panels that we did there. The other thing I did out of the Boeing work was got invited to present at UNESCO's Futures Literacy Forum, where we trialed the collaborative storytelling method that we devised for the Autonomous Flight project with some groups from right across the world at UNESCO. And we also started to then, all of this led to a wider kind of cultural life and professional impact. So How to Talk About Robots by Tabitha Goldstaub was influenced by our work and is a kind of popular science book trying to get women and girls to recognize and think about the impacts that AI might be having on their lives. So that was one element of the impact, which is the kind of cultural life impact. We also engaged quite rigorously with public policy. We presented to the House of Lords Select Committee on AI orally, and then we submitted written evidence, which was included in their report, and the lead author on that report has commented on the sort of transformative effect that engaging with the AI narratives work had on their thinking about the role of narratives. The AI Council has a working group on narrative that was set up precisely because of our work. And I went out to Dubai to convene a global governance AI roundtable session on AI narratives, which fed into the conversations that that were being had at the World Government Summit. And the other thing we did to do with policy was one of the external collaborators on the project was Dr. Claire Craig, who at the time was the Director of Science Policy at the Royal Society, as she was a great support and collaborator on the project. And as a result, we published this report, Portrayals and Perceptions of AI and Why They Matter, which was an out-facing policy report, as you can see, sort of stamped by the Royal Society. So a lot of impact on public policy. And then the Boeing project, of course, perhaps more narrowly, but did lead to industry impact, which is maybe one we in the humanities may or may not be able to claim. I haven't looked at all the case studies, but we produced an internal report to match the Futures publication for Boeing and presented it to their representatives when they came to Cambridge. The pandemic intervened. As you can see, the date of the report is May 2020. There was a phase 2 of the project planned, but unfortunately that never happened. I'm sure there's many tales to tell. So a change to the way in which Boeing thought about the way it gathered information about public perception and the way it took narratives into account when it was making its decision making. And then I just thought I'd end with what happened next, really, because the way in which REF makes us sort of parcel these up, they can feel like they're very hermetically sealed things, but of course they are not. And the AI narratives work fed into lots and lots of other work that has happened since then. Another publication on what AI researchers read, which is looking directly at the influence of their reading on their scientific practice. The book that was mentioned kindly in my introduction, Story Listening, Narrative Evidence and Public Reasoning, which, as you can see, was co-authored with Claire Craig. So the AI narratives work created a very productive intellectual partnership. And that book is itself now having its own impacts in the world. Next REF, here we come. And I've just put one of them up because I'm really proud of it. And I love the illustration that was commissioned for us. We had a piece in the big American magazine Science earlier this year in their policy forum strand. So it doesn't just end, and it's kept feeding both my intellectual work, my collaborations and my public practice. So it carries on. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah, for that. I like the way that throughout the talk you were saying that there isn't that kind of clear split between the research and the impact. They're not separate entities, they kind of feed into each other, and then the research came back at the end of your presentation as well. And I suppose it links back to what you started with, which is the idea that literature isn't kind of passively responding to developments in AI, that it's there forming opinion about it and forming the way that AI itself develops. So thank you very much. Let's move on then to Andrew. Thirdly, Andrew Kehoe, who is Professor of Corpus Linguistics at Birmingham City University. Andrew specialises in analysis of patterns and trends in large collections of online data, including news articles, blogs, tweets, and eBay listings. He recently led the AHRC-funded Track COVID project, which analysed responses to government messaging on Twitter during the pandemic. And this was cited in a House of Commons Public Accounts Committee report. Andrew's collaborative work with Matt Gee was a subject of case studies in REF 2014 and 2021. And the most recent case study described how freely available software tools that they developed were used by hundreds and thousands of people worldwide in research, teaching, translation, and policymaking. Okay, Andrew.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. So yeah, my full title is also very long, so I've put it on the slide here. It wouldn't fit on the title slide. So this case study is based on the work of the Research and Development Unit for English Studies, which is based within the School of English at BCU. We're quite a small school, 15.2 people, so we returned 2 case studies to the last REF. And we know they were both graded 4-star because we had 100% 4-star impact in our overall score. The other one is very different by my colleague Islam Issa, which was about his exhibition on the role of Muslim soldiers in World War I. So very different, but we did have one research assistant working across both case studies, gathering evidence. So that was quite helpful and quite useful. My case study is the focus of this presentation. And as you said, there's a collaboration with my colleague, Matt G, who's a research fellow and also a software developer. And it was based in the field of corpus linguistics, so analyzing large amounts of texts to find patterns and trends in language use. The main interest that Matt and I have is in online data. So things like topic detection in web pages and looking at analyzing word meaning automatically by the context of use and looking at how this is changing over time in different types of texts. So we ourselves publish research on those topics, but we also develop software tools to allow other people to apply these methods to their own data. And the development of these tools has been funded over the past 20 years or so by UKRI funding, and also various other sources. As you said, this is a continuing case study from what before last. So this is the same underpinning research, but with obviously different impact window and different users. And the users, as I'll show, are within our own discipline of corpus linguistics and linguistics more generally, but also in other academic disciplines and beyond academia as well. There's two main software tools that I'll talk about. They're shown on the right there, WebCorp and eMargin. First one, WebCorp, is like a suite of tools that allows people to search the web to find examples of words or phrases in context to see how language is used, particularly language that is too new, too recent, or too rare to appear in dictionaries or other offline corpora, like the British National Corpus. And it presents them in a format that's useful for teaching and research as well. So that's one of our tools, is WebCorp Live, and the other one is the WebCorp Linguist Search Engine, which is a larger scale web crawler that downloads content from the web and builds offline corpora for more detailed searching, corpora of news articles, blogs, tweets, novels, etc., all kinds of different things. So we first launched WebCorp Live in 2000, so quite a long time ago now, and it's been iteratively developed over all those years to obviously cope with changing technology, because this was pre-Google, the first version, but also in response to user feedback, so adding new features based on user feedback and comments. One of the issues for an impact case study is that the original tool wasn't designed with impact in mind, so there was no login required, and we didn't really have any way of tracking easily who was using it. It's totally open access, so anyone can go in there and search for whatever they want to. Second tool, eMargin, is, well, it was designed to bridge the gap between the quantitative approach of corpus linguistics and the introspective approach of literary close reading. So it's a collaborative annotation tool that can be used in the classroom or beyond the classroom online as well. And people can apply color coding to different parts of a text. The example there is David Copperfield, but obviously any text will work. You can add color coding tags, discussion threads based on individual words or phrases, and you can share text with groups of students or other users. But they're the two main tools that we used. In terms of the impact and the evidence, starting with WebCorp. So to meet those challenges that I mentioned, we relied mainly on Google Analytics for this particular part of the case study. So using the analytics, we knew how many people were using the tool and also where they were based. So the graphs on the right there show roughly where people are and how many people were using it every month, 5,000 a month in 190 countries. We used Google Scholar to find references to the software in academic publications, because those people who are using it in research also tend to use it in teaching as well. So that was quite helpful. And then the referrer data for the website showed who was using it in teaching. So it might be linked from Moodle or Blackboard or some of the VLE in some universities or other sites. So for example, we found that the European Parliament was recommending it as a translation tool through that Google referrer information. Of course, showing that people are using the tool is not enough for an impact case study. We also have to say how it was changing their practice. So we did that through testimonials from various people, either people who cited the tool in their publications, that's what the example there is on the bottom right, or people who'd contacted us to suggest new features or give us other kinds of feedback. We worked with them and gathered their feedback and used that in the case study as well. That was quite useful both ways. eMargin was slightly different because you do require login for that. So we had a database of users, so we knew exactly how many people had registered to use the tool during the impact window, so 12,629. And we knew how many texts they'd uploaded, 7,000 texts during that period. We did find that there was a particular spike in users during the COVID pandemic, actually. So COVID affected our case study positively because it's the online learning tools. People were turning online during that period. So we had 18,000 new users in the first few months of 2020, which obviously shows the usefulness for online learning as well. As evidence of the kind of wide applicability of the tool, we looked at the names of the groups that had been created by the users. So there's some examples on the right there. You can see it's universities, colleges, schools, and in various different subjects as well. So that gave us an idea of exactly what the tool was being used for. And then again, we had testimonials from individual users within the case study. For this one, there was one unanticipated use that we mentioned in the case study. There was a political party in Spain called Podemos that used it to allow members to comment on their draft manifesto. They just happened to find the tool and used it for that purpose. So we cited that, but it was quite challenging because we didn't really know who they were. We had no contact details for them, so that was quite tricky. I'll come back to the challenges at the end. So those tools that we already had that we were gathering evidence for, we did also develop a couple of new tools during the ref cycle, which obviously allowed us to tailor the feedback and the comments a lot more easily for the case study. So these new tools are based on the same technology, the same underlying research and expertise, but for new audiences. So this one, our survey says we designed this for university policymakers or planning and performance departments to analyze survey data, specifically NSS comments, positive and negative comments in the NSS. So we developed it with colleagues in our own university, in our own planning and performance department, and then rolled it out to beta testers at 4 other universities as well: Cardiff, Leeds, Edinburgh, Napier, and Glasgow Caledonian. And through that process, we were able to actually interview those people and gather more detailed feedback from them for inclusion in the case study. We gave them free access to the tool in exchange for the feedback. One other thing we did is we developed a specific version of our WebCorp software for use in teaching in schools and secondary schools specifically. So we worked with a commercial partner in Germany, and they had contacts in German secondary schools. So as well as developing a new interface for the software, so specifically for school level learners, we also developed teaching materials, so videos and interactive exercises based on our research that would help them to study language use in real text, if you like. So the example there is the difference between the words road and street, and the fact that you have street cred and road rage, but not the other way around. So it's looking at subtle differences between synonyms, basically. So again, through that process, we were able to gather feedback from lots of teachers and use that feedback in our case study. And there's an example there about the usefulness of the exercises and the fact that the tool runs on mobile phones, which students could use at home during the pandemic. Okay, I'll just close with the challenges then. So as in the previous presentation, there's a lack of linear relationship between the underpinning research, the outputs, and the impact. So our software is the underpinning research. It's also outputs. We return the software itself to REF as outputs. But the development of the software was still ongoing and being refined during the gathering of the impact. So those 3 things were kind of all happening at the same time. It wasn't a linear process. As I've already said, we designed the tools to be flexible and usable for lots of different types of users and tasks. But that did make it quite difficult to track the impact and to see exactly who was using the tools. And as I said, we were unable to gather feedback from the political party in Spain because of changing party leadership, the language barrier, and the fact that we didn't really know who they were. They just happened to use the tool. We knew from the logs that they were using it, but we didn't really know who was using it. The challenges of combining solicited and unsolicited feedback, we had both of those in the case study. And then the difficulty of separating teaching impact from academic impact. In the REF guidelines, academic impact doesn't count, but teaching impact does count. But when you're looking at log files in Google Analytics, for example, it's very difficult to know whether people are using it for research or teaching. And of course, the best teaching is informed by research. So people are using it in research and then using that research in their teaching. So it's not really as clear cut as the ref guidance suggests. And then finally, there was a lack of understanding at institutional level within our own institution of what counts as impact in our discipline. So we were told during an internal review that both of our case studies were 2-star with a very slim chance of 3-star by the internal reviewers outside our own faculty. And in fact, they were both 4-star. So that shows you that there's different concepts of impact in different disciplines, and it doesn't always translate across the fields. Okay, that's me. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions later.
Thank you, Andrew. I love that last slide. That's really useful, Andrew, to get, because of course you don't see these kind of issues when you're reading through the official impact case studies on the REF website. I'm glad you picked up as well, like in Sarah's paper, that I did the lack of the linear relationship between the research, the outputs and the impact, because it struck me while reading the impact case study, of course, the development of the software, as you say, is the research. It's not that you have a publication and then the impact comes and the development of the software linked to the publication.
Yeah, as I said,
really fascinating about the political party as well, and the problems of collecting information about that, and the things that they might be doing with your software that you don't know about.
Luckily, they went an extreme right-wing party. We checked that before we included them in the case study, so they were quite safe.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Okay, well, I say we'll come to questions at the end, but thank you, Andrew. So last in these presentations, but not least, we have Ursula Hurley from the University of Salford, who's Professor of Life Writing there. Her research interests are in socially engaged creative practice and co-creation. Ursula's interested in the innovative application of creative processes and creative practice in poetry, also novel writing, life writing, plays on the boundaries of fiction and non-fiction. She's committed to engaging communities in creative practice research, as all bound up with her impact case study we'll hear about now. And she's been a principal investigator for an HRC's Connected Communities project called In the Making, which I think she'll be talking a bit about now. Thank you, Ursula.
Thanks, Anthony, for that really generous introduction, and thanks to the other presenters for absolutely fascinating case studies. And Andrew, thank you for setting out those difficulties, as you say, the ordering of how you unpick the research, the engagement, the impact. And like you, an internal case study review told me I'd be lucky to get 1 star. So I think we did slightly better than that in the end. So I'll try and restrict this to 7 minutes, but by the time I've explained 3D printing and how it relates to poetry and what on earth that has to do with making positive impacts on perceptions of disability, please do tell me to be quiet if I'm overrunning, and I'm more than happy to answer questions or to follow up with anybody who would like to know a bit more about how this works. So I've just summarized and pulled out as bullet points the bits of the blurb to the case study that hopefully makes sense. So it was called In the Making: How Creative Writing Methodologies Enabled Inclusive 3D Printing Practices. And as other presenters have said, you know, that title was itself a long time in the making, trying to work out how to be transparent, how to be clear about what this was offering. So essentially, we used creative writing experiments as a way of engaging a group of people who identified as disabled. So when I say disabled, we use the social model of disability where the world is disabling and therefore people are disabled by it, but I'm aware that that is a contested term, but that was something that we qualified and clarified in the case study. So a group of people who identified as disabled, and we used creative writing experiments and found a process of translating these creative writing processes into digitally fabricated objects, and this included things like wearable text. What you can see on the slide here is somebody had made the word overcome out of pipe cleaners And then through our engagement with human computer interaction specialists and our technical experts and makerspace colleagues, we were able to translate that into a 3D print. But what you might be able to see just there on the corner of the white printed plastic version is a little hole, and there's one on the other side so that the wearer could actually wear that as a necklace or make a plaque or something that they could kind of tell the world about their experience. So we collaborated, as I said, with disabled people and technical experts, and what we managed to establish through this collaboration was that 3D printing can be used to reveal previously hidden aspects of selfhood. And we did work with people who were very neurodiverse, who had a range of intellectual disabilities, and also some people who were non-verbal, and we used avatars in that sense. So what we found was we developed a methodology which supported disabled people to engage with digital fabrication and to produce conscious affirmations of agency. And part of the impact was how they were able to challenge these pervasive narratives of disability as a lack or a deficiency or something to be pitied. And within makerspace culture, this was, we claimed, a significant departure because we did a survey of existing practices, and most of those practices were limited to other people making assistive aids for disabled people. So when we said this is what we're doing, a lot of makerspace people said, oh, what you mean like making plastic cup holders that clip onto wheelchairs? And that was as far as they had got in terms of what they thought the relationship was between 3D printing and disability. Right, just let me see if this will move on. Where are we? I'm not sure it's going to, oh, there we go. Right, so here we can see a 3D selfie emerging on the print bed. And what really attracted us as creative writers was this kind of special kind of materialism. And we kind of theorized that this transformation of the material could point us towards alternative histories and stories. That was our hunch, and you can see other artists, other practitioners. This here is Rowan Bailey, but nobody was doing this with creative writing. Nobody was doing this with poetry. So very quickly, I'll talk you through one of the methodologies. So it's very much a methodology of constraint. It's drawing on traditions like Oulipo and more contemporary practitioners like Kenneth Goldsmith's uncreative writing and Hazel Price's The Writing Experiment. So we would do very simple iterative exercises such as what makes you feel trapped, and you might say interminable Zoom conferences perhaps, but that's what we would do. And then we would what makes you feel free, and we would do this very quickly, and we could go around a table and collect a lot of responses, or we could do it one-to-one and maybe do that twice and create a haiku-like text. And where necessary, we had one-to-one facilitators and communication helpers where that was needed. And so it created poetic units. You can see here somebody had written independence, time, liberty, locked. You can see how that moved into a very simple piece of software called Inkscape, which is open source. And then our technical facilitators developed this way of 3D printing. You could use anything. It doesn't have to be a 3D printer, but we found that 3D printers were particularly engaging, and they drew people in, and they brought community groups into our activities. So somebody here has created like a bookmark or a plaque. And what they've done, they chose the font, they chose the color of the PLA, the plastic, and also they chose to literally depress the text because they were talking about the experience of depression. Somebody else here, the second plaque that you can see, this was somebody with a severe intellectual disability, and they wanted, with a lot of facilitation, to get out the idea that they were really excited when they got to go out and go and see their family. Again, they chose the color, they chose the smileys, and they chose that bold embossed text. So we were starting to co-create kind of expressive tools that went beyond just the text itself. We also collaborated with visual artists. So here the autumn leaf inspired somebody with the word harmonic. And again, we brought that into the 3D printing space and created this plaque, which if somebody wanted to, one of the things we looked at was entrepreneurship and whether this could empower economically excluded people to actually perhaps start their own businesses. I could see this on Etsy maybe as somebody selling plaques that people could print print things with or use as pictures or images. One of the things that's so helpful about 3D printing is that the design file is endlessly distributable, replicable, modifiable. So it could be printed at scale in different materials. It could be done in concrete or metal or whatever you wanted to do, and at whatever size you wanted to do. So there's an awful lot of potential in that distributable manufacture model. So what we brought out of it, one of the impacts we actually found was this creative methodology, which we found is transferable, and we think is going to lead into an impact case study for the next ref, because you can take it away from 3D printing and apply it pretty much in any situation where collaborative creativity might be going on. So it was an open-mindedness about what creative activities are or can be. Sometimes people will come with that narrative of, I'm not creative, I'll get it wrong, I can't do it. So it's taking away that pressure. As I mentioned, we use techniques like Oulipo to simplify, to create precise constraints. We constantly presented very clear and limited choices. We didn't overwhelm people with an excess of choice, you know, the terror of the blank page. We were systematic, so we kept going. If it didn't seem to be working, we kept at it. And if somebody didn't want to respond, we respected that gap or silence as part of the collaborative process. So we built through reiteration, and we didn't announce what we'd created until it emerged off the print bed, and we could say, look what you have made, look what you have done. And something about the physicality of being able to snatch that object off the print bed and say, this is mine, I did it, that seemed to be incredibly empowering. And we think moving forward, we need to engage psychology colleagues to try to really understand what's going on with that manifestation of agency. So just drawing this together, there was a monograph that came out of it, which writes up you know, the entire thing and how we went about it, how it was pitched, the things that didn't work, the challenges that we had. It was really challenging to engage the target audience. It was incredibly difficult sometimes just physically getting people into a makerspace. All sorts of issues with transport. So I'd say doing more of this, you need a lot of budget for care, for transport, sometimes for food and accommodation as well. There's a little film there which I can pop in the chat if anybody wants to watch that, which says a bit more about it. But what I just wanted to emphasize here is, you know, we talk about poetry and people saying, what's it for? Why should people do degrees that involve poetry? And I love this quotation from Kazim Ali: we actually need a new brain, new shapes for thought. We've always already done this in poetry. And that was kind of the thing that we took as we went charging around, confusing people and saying, what on earth is this and how does it work and how does it connect? That's what we would try to use as our justification. That was our connecting phrase between the technology and the creativity. Okay, so that's the end of my slide, but I'll be hoping to answer some questions in the chat. Right, let me stop sharing this.
Okay, thank you very much, Ursula. It's a fantastic story, isn't it, that you tell in the impact case study of co-creation effectively. And it's fascinating how the end of the case study, you didn't talk too much about the kind of policy stuff in the case study, but the co-creation leads to it. It's not this kind of top-down academic thing which leads to an engagement with an audience and then discussions of policy. It's co-creation all the way through. That lovely term you use in your case study of purposeful meandering, which I really liked, as an integral part of that co-creation. Okay, thank you, Ursula. So it is now 5:02, so we have some time for questions if there are any. I can't see any in the chat so far, but oh, Jenny has a question. Jenny has a virtual hand up. Go on then, Jenny.
So I'm just trying to, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Trying to unmute. Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. Everybody kept time as well. It was amazing. So much information, so many ideas. I was really interested in intertwining, the meandering, the difficulty of ordering that REF makes us do. All of that I found really fascinating. but I wanted to ask about a different kind of collaboration and whether the 4 speakers see any mileage in this idea. I was at an HRC event yesterday, and I was just hearing about, I was being reminded what we all know, that we have a government that's very STEM focused. So when they talk about, they see the future as technology, and they talk about, obviously, AI as part of that. What nobody ever talks about, but which your 4 case studies exemplify brilliantly for me, is that it's about the collaboration between, the interaction between human and artificial intelligence. And I'm just wondering, obviously this series is meant to promote this kind of work, but I'm just wondering if that's a space that we can own to try and get political parties, media to engage more with the really innovative and thrilling work that's going on in that space between human and artificial intelligence. If you think it's a bad idea, just tell me and I'll stop thinking about that.
Ursula, do you want to respond to that first?
Yes, so thank you so much for the question. And it is amazing to hear these case studies alongside each other. And thanks to Anthony for actually thinking to do that and go, what's here? Because on first look, they might look really disparate, but in fact, there are so many kind of resonances and connections. And I was frantically making notes. I think there's real political potential here. I can tell you a story that while we were doing our funded project, we worked very closely with Disability Rights UK, and they had connections in government and with senior civil servants. And we went to see the then Minister for Disabled People, and he just didn't get it at all. Just that I can think of cheaper ways to engage people. Why don't you hire a church hall and give them some biscuits? So absolutely, you know, we need to, maybe if we speak together, maybe if we do find ways to connect across the different disciplines that we're seeing here, those kind of picking out those deep resonances and those deep underpinnings, and keep doing the things that Anthony and colleagues are doing here with these events, maybe we'll get there. But yeah, if anyone's got any ideas about how we build a coalition and how we make that case more strongly, because I think it's so disparate. And as Anthony said, when you search the website, it doesn't necessarily come up. It's not evident, it's not clear. So yeah, I'm open to any ideas that anybody else might have.
Okay, I think Andrew was first and then Sarah.
Yeah, I would agree with that point, that it's important to raise the visibility of what all of us are doing at national government level. But it's also, I think, important to raise the visibility within our own institutions, because as I mentioned in my presentation, they don't really see how what we do is impactful, even though the external assessment proves that it is. So I think there is a challenge as well in helping our own institutions to understand what impact in English looks like.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Sarah, you wanted to come in?
I think my experience might be slightly different. I always recognise that it is. Cambridge is a weird and wonderful and privileged place, and it's not the norm. But in my experience being here, and in my experience engaging, and I think it's really important to make this distinction between Whitehall and between the government of the day. And so where my engagements have been primarily with Whitehall and policymakers, and there's an absolute recognition of the need for humanities knowledge. And most of this has come out of the story listening work rather than the AI narratives work. But as I said, you know, they're connected. Absolute appetite and recognition that when it comes to, you know, pressing issues of the day, be they technology, be they AI specifically, or climate change, or any of the others we might list, that a plural evidence base is needed. I mean, we've had absolutely no pushback against that argument at all. In fact, what we've had is, yes, we know, show us how to do it, give us the experts who are willing to engage with us, give us the tools for how we can be confident in the rigor and the robustness of the knowledge that's coming out of your disciplines. So I haven't had a kind of negative experience in that respect. But I take your point that whoever the ruling power might be is not necessarily listening to or influenced by or aligned with the openness that I've encountered. I was very struck, Jenny, by your excellent response to the Times piece on Twitter about the catastrophic crisis of the humanities, and just hitting that Twitter feed with just the evidence that these narratives are not true. So ironically, given I work on narrative, it's also about pushing back on certain narratives, and we can do that through these kinds of events, through wider engagement with government. Even if they don't listen, it's still worth saying it to them, because they might listen later, or you might have planted a seed, which means they think differently further on, or if evidence comes to them in a policy synthesis report and that's included, they will remember that conversation. So I mean, I'm an eternal optimist, but never be disheartened even if they dismiss, because you don't know what that might actually lead to, and so kind of on all those fronts. And I guess the other thing with me is not buy into those narratives ourselves, actually, and be confident about the narratives that we have about our own discipline, rather than a narrative of sort of crisis. That was a bit polemic, sorry. So the answer, Jenny, is yes, we should do that, but we should own all of these spaces. We are of value in all of these spaces.
Thanks, Sarah. Gabrielle, I don't know if you've got time. I know you need to go. Do you want to say something briefly about this? Is it the same in kind of museum and heritage studies, or is there not the same kind of disconnect that we've been talking about?
My experience was always has been more similar to Sarah's. So everywhere I've encountered not only the fact that this kind of work is profoundly welcome, but also I usually tend to encounter the fact that computer scientists, at least the people collaborate with, profoundly inspiring, and always want to collaborate with people in the humanities. This is true very much so internationally, so much so that the biggest computer science conference I attend to, which is CHI, used to be purely computer science when I started some 15 years ago, and now there's a huge humanities grouping within that. So, and again, I'm not talking about government, but I'm talking about all the various organizations that work around it, including Whitehall. So I think our work is welcome. Whether the media are telling this story as well, I don't know. And I think perhaps it's the media we need to focus on to reverse this, because my experience of negativity comes from there rather than from anybody in government or any parallel organization.
Thanks, Gabrielle. No, that's really useful. And that's absolutely right, isn't it? That your experience certainly mirrors mine as well, working with scientists and people working in tech companies. They've always appreciated the work that we do in the humanities. So that kind of negativity is coming from somewhere else, isn't it? As you said, maybe especially from media rather than particularly government. Are there any other questions? Thanks, Jenny, for that. If not, could I pick up on Andrew's slide about challenges to do with the impact case studies, because partly this series was set up, with early career academics in mind, people who haven't done impact case studies before, are kind of a how to begin to think about putting an impact case study together. So can maybe all of you say something about the particular challenges you had putting the case studies together? Because when you read them from the website, they come across as these beautifully written, seamless narratives where nothing could possibly go wrong and there were no challenges at all. But yeah, can we look behind the scenes a little bit about what was happening?
Should I put my challenges slide back on the screen? Is that helpful?
If you'd like to, Andrew, yeah.
Yeah, I've still got it open, so I can do that. Yeah. Hang on. Okay, can you see that now?
Do you want to say a bit more, Andrew? Maybe you start off about
Okay,
this?
I will. Yeah, I will do. So, yeah, well, the main one I think is the lack of linear relationship and the fact that the form is so kind of structured in separating the underpinning research from the impact, when really those two things, in our case, were happening at the same time. It was quite difficult to separate them, and we had a lot of internal advice that turned out to be wrong about how to do that. So that was quite challenging. The final polished case study went through a lot of revisions during the process over a 2-year period. So yeah, that was a challenge. Yeah, just gathering the evidence really, and knowing exactly what we're allowed to use and whether we're allowed to name people or not, and those kinds of things. That was a challenge, and the advice we were getting as well was quite contradictory about whether we can name specific people in the case study, even if they'd given us permission to name them. So that was challenging. And then, as I said, this thing about solicited feedback versus unsolicited feedback, because obviously if you're asking people specific questions in an interview, you can tailor what they're saying to the needs of the case study. But if they're just sending you generic feedback through a feedback form like we had on our website, then it might not be very useful for proving the points that we're trying to prove for the ref impact case study. So that was definitely challenging as well.
Okay, thanks. So what do you think about this, different disciplines not understanding what counts as impact? Is there any way through that, do you think? I mean, it seemed to me when I was preparing impact case studies at my institution, that seemed to be that worry from outside English studies that unless you can prove exactly how this publication led to that impact, it wasn't worth doing a case study about it.
Yeah, we did have that challenge. I think it's because the people at the highest level who were doing the review process were mainly engineers and scientists. So they're used to impact where you develop some kind of widget or some kind of device, and then people use that device and you can get really concrete feedback about it. But I mean, for English, ours is closest to that, because we're developing a tool that people are using. But I know a lot of the other case studies in English is more abstract. It's quite difficult to pin down. And the other one in my own department, the exhibition that my colleague Islam ran, showing the role of Muslim soldiers in World War I, that was very different and very difficult to, very different to evidence, shall I say, the different kinds of evidence we had to collect.
Thanks. Ursula, do you want to pick up on that? Because you had that video that you've helpfully put in the chat as well. About
it's interesting, because I started off getting quite a negative and hostile. Again, I think the people at the top are looking at things through a STEM lens. And then, after it did much, much better than expected in REF, then there were videos and, it was sort of being shown as something that the university actually wanted to highlight. But I think you're absolutely right. It's that lack of linearity, and particularly I think co-created research doesn't fit the model of the form that we have to complete. If you're co-creating, you don't do some research and then apply it. You are doing everything kind of braided all at the same time. So in a way, it felt a little bit artificial to it was really like imposing a narrative structure, thinking what are the underpinnings, what are the enablers, and just sort of trying to separate out the different elements of the research. And something that I hadn't really thought of as particularly interesting research as a creative writer was actually just that survey of makerspaces and attitudes and that kind of benchmark of practice. And once I realized that could be posed as the underpinning research, suddenly everything else could unfold in a way that made sense to an external reader. And I was very fortunate. I was able to bid for some internal funding, which allowed an independent researcher to go back and pick up with some of our participants and really do in-depth qualitative interviews about how they felt sort of a year after the intervention. What were they still doing? Were they still making, what had happened? How did they feel about their experience? And we were able to bring out a lot of, which we were able to then turn into different themes. These were the themes, these were the things that our participants said had benefited them, but that needed a lot of extra resource. And I was fortunate to be able to get that from my institution, I think, once they realized that it was worth investing in. But yeah, that follow-up, and I think the point that Jenny's made in the chat, what people engage, but then then what happened. And I guess also for me, it was, we engaged 96 of the most marginalised people in Greater Manchester, but I was being told that was not a big enough sample and it didn't count and it wasn't impressive enough. And again, that's possibly disciplinary differences or differences in expectation that are in play. Yes, I think I don't have an answer, but I think those are my reflections thus far.
I'm laughing, Ursula, because we were told the opposite, that because our impact wasn't local, because it wasn't specific, because it wasn't working with particular communities, that it wasn't focused enough. So
that's funny.
Yeah. I want to just make sure that we don't confuse the sort of why, it's because we've come straight from Jenny's question to this question, that we don't confuse the kind of wider debates about our value with just the ref. So I think it was a good idea to take the impact case studies and use them and publicize them. So this is a both and. That's one way to show our value and our impact, but it's not the only one. So I just kind of wanted to separate those out. But if we are just focusing on the ref, it's a form of hoop jumping, and we've got to do it. And I love your idea that basically any case study is a fiction. It's a short story. What you don't see is the track changes behind it, and the I'm not saying we didn't do anything. We did everything that's on here. We absolutely did, and I'm proud of what we did. But the way in which we had to frame it and tell that story is intentional, and it's intentional in relation to what we think we're going to get assessed on. So in that sense, we should be quite good at them in English studies to some extent, because we're good at understanding how to tell stories. So that would be one of the things, is just to recognize that these are fabricated in themselves representations. In terms of challenges, or at least kind of what you might need to be open to, because I work collaboratively a lot and outside of academia, I'm very used to not being proprietorial over my own text, and that was something that really helped. Like I don't know, I had to download this from the UKRI website, the REF website, because I didn't actually have a copy of the final thing that had been submitted. So that sense of also recognizing that there are people trained in REF impact stuff who might fiddle with it in ways that you don't really like, but they know is going to work. In the end, I was just sort of as long as they weren't saying anything that wasn't true, I was happy to let them do that. I think also Ursula's point about longitudinal impact is really important, and it does take resources to be able to go back to people a year later, 5 years later, 10 years later, and this has been discussed at length with the changes between the previous ref and this one. But that focus on kind of immediacy, which becomes a hollow claim. There was a LSE impact blog article earlier this week or last week on hype and overclaiming in impact case studies based on an academic article, and it might be something of interest to people listening. I'll put the link in the chat in a minute. So that sense of being one of the challenges is actually jumping through the hoop but not overclaiming, and I think we've got better at that between the two ref cycles. And the point about explaining to people that engagement isn't impact, I knew that, but a lot of my colleagues didn't. And so being, if you know that something you're doing is going to be a case study in the future, do whatever you want to do and think is important, but a little bit of strategic thinking early on, rather than doing it all retrospectively about, if this is engagement, is there a way in which I can build in evaluation that makes it impactful, or can evidence that it's impactful, because we all know that these things are impactful in ways we can't possibly measure, like talking to a politician who doesn't agree with you, but who knows. So a bit of strategy from the kind of beginning of any kind of work like this, with an eye on ref, but without compromising the importance of what you think is important and valuable in what you're doing.
Thanks, there. Yeah, it's a really important point, isn't it, about thinking ahead with your valuation studies, being strategic as well, which is very important for you thinking early career researchers about developing impact case studies. Don't end up having to collect all the evidence retrospectively, which certainly happened in a couple of case studies in my institution. We found it really hard. We kind of got there in the end, but it is a really difficult process to do it within the last couple of years of the cycle. Are there any other questions? I can't see any. If not, I have a question about policy. If you're talking about change, policy in some ways is seen as the kind of the holy grail of change within impact case studies. And all three of your impact case studies, Gabriella's as well, in terms of a different context, museum and heritage studies and museum policy. But it was particularly governmental policy for Sarah and Ursula, and institutional policy for Andrew, developing software that's then used by particular universities. Could you just say a bit more about that? What was your experience of engaging with these government committees? Was it wholly positive or not? Ursula, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And policy in my case study was really promising, but I don't think it ever got to the point where we could claim an actual change. I think we could claim influence, but that's really hard to, to evidence. I was fortunate in that I was able to have a community co-investigator. I'm not sure if that's still possible, but at the time we were able to access that. And we had the communications director from Disability Rights UK, and they happened to serve as a secretary for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Disability. So we had a really, really good working relationship with the chair of that group and a lot of support from them. And so we were able to feature as a case study in a report that was done about, it was called Halving the Employment Gap, and it was looking at why disabled people are so excluded from work. And they cited our project as an example of good practice that should be taken up and replicated, which was great, but then we couldn't prove that anything further at that point had happened. We were about to do a big event and book launch at the Houses of Parliament. They'd invited us to come and do that and speak to their committee, and it was going to be, a national splash. And then unfortunately lockdown happened and none of that happened. So it was there and it didn't quite come to fruition. But I'd say it's so much about those kind of working relationships, and having a way in, or having a contact, or having somebody who can help you navigate. And we were very fortunate in that way, but I wouldn't claim to have succeeded or to have a great deal of expertise there. I think it's finding the right collaborators, certainly from my perspective.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Do you maybe want to come in next? Because your impact case study was talking to the government committee on AI, is that right?
The House of Lords Select Committee, yeah. Well, I mean, since this impact case study, it's a space that I inhabit hugely. In fact, I'm now on the board of the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at Cambridge. So it's led me in a direction I didn't anticipate my career going. And there is wider support for this. There's UKRI policy fellowships now. People can apply to go and sort of be embedded in government departments. There's a training course that runs annually, I think. So it's a space that I very much enjoy being in and have found hugely productive intellectually and for other reasons. Just lots of amazing people. It's been great to meet. It's been universally accepting and open and open-minded and eager for the knowledge that our discipline can bring. So it's rather glowing in that sense. When you bring ref impact case studies into it, they'll laugh at the idea that anybody could prove that any piece of work has changed anything. That's just not how policy making works, not least because policy making works if it's done properly on the basis of synthesis, which is that you would never, ever make a policy decision based on a single piece of work. You would, whether that be scientific or humanistic, a good policy, brief or proposal is based on an evidence synthesis, which takes, which asks experts to map the terrain in their discipline of knowledge of relevance to the policy issue. That map will include identifying difference and disagreement, but it must be as capacious as the expert kind of is able to do. So the idea that you could prove that something you'd done had changed policy is a misunderstanding of how policy making actually relates to evidence, and that might be something we want to feed into the next ref. So the biggest impact I think you could ever claim is that you've talked to these people and that they've maybe cited your evidence in the report, or they've cited your work in something like that. That's as far as you're gonna get, I think.
Just besides the kind of what Ursula was talking about, just merely having those conversations, Ursula, is the kind of effect on policy, isn't it? Andrew, do you want to say anything about kind of institutional policy in the universities, through the software that you developed?
Yeah. So as you said, I didn't engage with government for this particular case study, but I have since with the Track COVID project. So I submitted evidence to the Public Accounts Committee in the House of Commons for that project. And as you say, the fact that they cited us in their report is often the best we can hope for, because we can't prove that because our evidence was about encouraging the government to change the way they communicate with the public through social media. So that's obviously a very big challenge. So we can't prove that that's worked, but we can prove that they've cited us in their reports at least. So that's something. In terms of the university policymakers, we were able to show that to some extent because we were focusing on the NSS, National Student Survey. So we could show that the scores in a particular category had improved from one year to the next based on the advice that they'd given to their departments based on analyzing the feedback with our tool. So that was at least something. So if they did badly in provision of library facilities, for example, and our software showed that through the analysis of the comments, then we could show some kind of impact based on improvements to that score the following year, although obviously the NSS is kind of a lottery. It depends on individual students and how they're feeling on a particular day. So yeah, but yeah, that was at least some way of measuring it, but it is definitely difficult to show, especially on a large scale, how you've affected people's lives in any meaningful way. Yeah, that's a challenge.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And we're getting to the last 5 minutes or so. Are there any other questions from the audience? I can't see anything in the chat. If not, we'll maybe begin to draw this session to a close. Thank you very much to the fantastic speakers. Gabriella, who's had to go, Gabriella's an hour ahead of us in Italy, and to Ursula and Sarah and Andrew. I hope it's been interesting for those attending the session. I hope you've got a sense of the breadth of the case studies in technology across English studies. There are so many of these case studies, as I said at the beginning. Once I actually delve down further into the REF database, we may have another session on English studies and technology in the autumn. We will have to see. But thanks to the speakers. Thank you very much, everybody attending. Thanks to Becky, as usual, for organising these events. And we hope to see you soon at the next event. Becky, is there one lined up for the future, or is that it for a while for these Speaking for English?
We've definitely got some bubbling away, nothing to confirm quite yet, but do keep an eye out because there'll be some coming to you soon. I don't know if Jenny, you've got any more intel on that?
We'll have one on policy, and then there's another one. I can't remember the topic, but we would welcome another one on technology. This one has been amazing. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jenny. Okay, thanks again to the speakers, Sarah, Ursula, Andrew and Gabriella.
Thank you.
And we'll see you soon at the next event. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.